This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras.
I'm James Majewski.
Yeah, we figured we'd do it that way this time. Instead of me introducing his name,
man.
He introduces his own name. You know, it's more Captain Planet-y that way. All right, so here today we are in Lent, and we're going to be doing some religious films during Lent. And this one is one that I have heard recommended on a number of occasions by various people. The 2006 film The Island, or Ostrov, directed by Pavel Lungin and written by Dmitry Sobolov. And what, does that sound not good?
If only we could have them on the show to say their own names as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so this one's going to be interesting. This is a Russian film, right?
It's a Russian film about an Orthodox monk.
It's going to be interesting because I think this one, perhaps more than a lot of the films we've covered, I'm just going to assume that our audience has not seen, you know? Because, like, yes, this one has come up for me as well. I've heard people mention it from time to time as, like, a good, you know, religious Catholic film worth seeing. It's not Catholic, but it appeals to a Catholic sensibility.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, for whatever reason, I've never watched it. This was my first time seeing it. And I think that, you know, it's not comfortably nestled within, like, the broader canon of classics of film or of religious film.
Right.
So I do think that a lot of people listening to this are probably not going to have seen the film.
It's got a bit of a reputation, but you know, who knows? I wonder. I can't remember who recommended it to me and whether they were Catholic or Orthodox, for that matter.
Yeah.
You know, but I would put it. You know, I think it's a good film, and maybe you could call it like a minor classic of religious cinema.
Yeah. Well, I really liked it. I was surprised at how much I liked this film. And when I say surprised, you know, I think it's really just because when was this film made?
2006.
Right. So it's relatively recent. I guess that's, you know, almost 20 years ago. But it's still, like, you know, these early 2000s religious films, I go into with a little bit of a grain of salt, you know. So this is, you know, around the same era as, like, For Greater Glory, or, you know, Restless Heart.
That's true, and yet it comes out of, like, a very different film industry, so it may not be related to that boom at all.
Exactly. So I just bring it up because on the surface, when you look at it, especially if you look up a trailer online, the trailer online is not very good at all.
Oh, really?
Of giving you an indication of what the tone of this film.
Interesting.
In fact, I think when I looked it up, it was listed under genre of, like, comedy/drama or something, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that it's easy to take a look at this film and sort of maybe place it into that kind of a context, when really tonally, cinematically, poetically, spiritually is sitting at kind of a higher level than those other ones, which isn't to say that they aren't good in their own way, only that this one I would recommend much more readily and assign to this category of, like, classic.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you want to give an idea of what the film's about, James?
Yeah. It begins with kind of a flashback of this young man who's shoveling coal on, you know, a ship. It's sort of like a barge transporting large mounds of coal, and the ship is overtaken by a Nazi German patrol boat. So this is 1940s.
It's in, like, a very chilly black and white, like an almost blue black and white.
Yes. And so this ship is taken, you know, hostage by these German soldiers, and the only two crew members, this coal shoveler and the captain, are about to be executed when sort of, you know, I guess one of the German soldiers has the kind of sick idea of making the coal shoveler execute his own captain in exchange for his life. And this is sort of an empty bargain because after they leave him there on the ship, after he has indeed shot his captain, they detonate bombs, charges that they placed on the ship. The ship is blown up, and this coal shoveler who's left for dead washes up on the shore of an island that's inhabited by this religious community of Orthodox priests, monks, lay novitiates or whatever. And then we fast forward to the present context of the film. This is like Cold War era. This coal shoveler has become somewhat of a holy fool. So I'm not super familiar with this tradition of the holy fool right. in the East, but he's not exactly a priest, or a monk. He's not really a part of the community in like a formally professed way.
He is a priest, though. Don't they call him Father Anatoly?
Yeah, but I don't think that that's indicating. We never see him celebrating the sacraments,
No.
So I think that that's probably an honorific indicating his holiness.
I see.
But anyway, he's clearly eccentric, has kind of weird shenanigans and outbursts.
Plays pranks on people.
Yes.
Pretends to be someone else when the, regular lay people come to him asking for help.
But he's also very committed to prayer, to reparation, and he's sought after by lay people from the mainland for spiritual counsel. And so we get to see something of his spiritual wisdom as well throughout. So I would really say that this film is a study of this archetype, the character of the holy fool. His name is Father Anatoly, is how he's referred to. And we really just follow his day-to-day life. The film opens up with, his kind of his regular routine, as he's also seeing some of these visitors who are coming to him for advice. And then we see his eccentricity, but also his humility. And the sort of nature of these encounters kind of escalates throughout. They get sort of more and more sort of spiritually grave. And his interactions with the Father Superior of this community on the island, as well as one of the other priests, Father Job, also sort of are further developed throughout the film. In some respects, these two priests, the Father Superior and Father Job, are kind of foils. Like we learn more about him by the contrast that we see in them. They're not villains or anything, they're not bad people. They're all well-intentioned, but Father Anatoly and his antics, kind of bring to light some of their faults and challenge them in various ways as well. I think that's as good of a synopsis as you can expect from me.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is he's very much haunted by what he did. I didn't find a lot of information in English about the film, but in Wikipedia there were a couple of quotes translated from interviews in Russian, and one of them was he said, or maybe it was the writer who said this, but I have read the lives of many ascetics, and the images of the main character are based on Theophilus of the Caves and Sebastian of Karaganda.
And at least one of them is a holy fool.
Yes.
So they both seem to be wonder workers in their own way, and we do see Father Anatoly in this film work wonders.
Yes.
But especially Theophilus of the Caves.
Yes, Theophilus the Weepy apparently is his name. So
awesome. In the quick, skimming that we did on this guy, this saint, this holy man, there seem to be a lot of anecdotes about him that are reminiscent of things that we see in this film. But one thing that's worth mentioning is the suggestion that we came across that this was a feigned foolery.
Yes.
Ostensibly to conceal his humility and wisdom. So I don't know to what extent that's associated in each case with this holy fool character.
Right.
Whether there may or may not be some extent of like legitimate, eccentricity, we'll say. But definitely in this film, there's room to interpret it that way, because we don't just see this Father Anatoly's tomfoolery. We also see his real thoughtfulness and spiritual depth.
Yeah.
So I think that it's definitely possible to read it as an act. But if you look at the young, coal shoveler at the beginning of the film in this flashback, he's kind of strange too,
Is he strange before he gets put under stress though? Like no, it's just
but
that moment when he's like under threat of death.
But it's pretty heightened, it's pretty like extreme, his response.
Yeah.
It's like he's very afraid of death. And so he's really groveling, which isn't to say that this is indication
sign of
that
mental illness.
Yeah, but it's like at the very least a sign of like a very weak constitution,
right.
And but you could read it as like indicative also of
My impression of the character is he's probably naturally somewhat eccentric, but being eccentric doesn't make you insane or mentally ill,
right?
And that he amplifies that and knows when to play it up. And also it's not that it's all calculated, but also that it's under the influence of the Holy Spirit as well.
Right.
Much as St. Francis of Assisi or St. Philip Neri, it could be debated the degree to which those are related to like the holy fool archetype. But, both did outlandish things, both gave kind of outlandish sort of penitential practices, or rather, St. Francis, told his guys to like preach naked in this church for like their humility and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like also there's plenty of examples of the saints being very playful, and humorous.
Yes.
But I think from my understanding of this holy fool tradition is that it actually does involve like a certain degree of feigned or not like craziness,
yes,
like acting kind of off.
Yes.
Yes. And anyway, I think that so far as it goes, this is an excellent portrait of that.
Yeah.
Because it's first off, the performance is amazing. I don't know the name of this actor, but you were mentioning that he was like
he was in like, I read on Wikipedia that he was in this Russian rock band that was like one of the only bands that sort of broke out of like was known outside of Russia.
Wow.
And then he kept playing in it, but he had this conversion at some point, and when he wasn't on tour, he would be sort of living in reclusion.
Yeah, so interesting.
And they got him to play this character.
Well,
and he got a blessing from his like spiritual father to do this role.
He does an incredible job. It's an awesome performance. Not just good because it's like very believable and technically proficient, but also because it's so grounded. It's just this is such a challenging kind of a character.
Yeah.
Someone who's very holy, very saintly, but also given to these sort of strange behaviors.
Yeah.
And yet here we see it come together very organically and yes, be very grounded in like the reality of this man's own spiritual struggle. His which is largely framed by this guilt that he feels, or this sorrow maybe over what he's thought he's done, which is killed a man, someone who was his comrade.
Right.
Now another thing that contributes to this is I think just the skillfulness of the writing, the way that the film is sort of carried out. It reminds one of Tarkovsky or certain kind of like transcendental films that are very slow, but are drawing you into the spiritual world of this character.
Right.
It also reminded me of, something like The Flowers of St. Francis, because we're getting these kind of vignettes, these snippets of encounters. It's very enjoyable to watch for that reason.
Yeah, it's much more accessible than Tarkovsky, I would say. But it did remind me of him sometimes in the pacing and in some of the shots. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mentioned it also just because of there's this tonal quality of its its quietness, you know, its ponderousness.
Yeah.
You know, there is a kind of contemplative eye
Yeah.
that the camera has, despite, you know, also being, as you say, much more accessible.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know
It's
if,
a much more straightforward story,
Yes.
you know, than Andrei
Yeah.
Rublev or whatever.
you know, what it reminded me of too was Calvary. You know, we covered that a long time ago.
Yeah.
But that film starring Brendan Gleeson as, you know, a parish priest.
There was one shot that reminded me of Calvary when he looks out the window and sees the church burning.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But I think that,
Or the building, yeah.
you know, some of what gave me Calvary vibes was, first off, the setting. You know, there's a lot of walking out in nature.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
lot
yeah.
of water, wind. You know, there's a kind of solitary quality to.
And also the sort of set of characters who come to him.
Correct.
That's probably the big thing.
There's a very kind of local
Structures the film, really.
Yeah, and it there's kind of it's like a local view.
Yeah.
Because it's just this community, and then whatever visitors they get from outside.
Right.
Calvary similarly kind of focused on a set of core characters, and then, you know, maybe a few others. But
Yeah.
you
know, the actor also reminded me of the actor who plays Michelangelo in that movie Sin that we
sure.
discussed.
Yeah,
the performance
that's a good
reminded me
comparison.
of that.
Yeah. But I think another way in which the Calvary comparison is apt is because this character is kind of edgy, you know, kind of offbeat,
Yes.
you know, and maybe in that respect, in some ways controversial.
Right.
You know, there are going to be things about this characterization that I think people will find challenging and sort of question the relative morality of, you know, just as you would in watching Calvary.
Right.
That priest is similarly edgy and offbeat. But in both those instances, I think what's undeniable is that there is a portrait of real personal holiness, you know, and it's a personal holiness that is very real. So you get a sense, you can taste the spiritual struggle, you know, you can kind of taste the grit in the teeth, you know, and so I think it's a very valuable film to watch, especially, you know, at a time like this holy season, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the sort of interesting things with the film is the relations he has with his fellow monks, Father Job, and I can't remember the superior's name.
Father Philaret.
Father Philaret, yes. And Father Job seems to have a bit of a problem with Father Anatoly, but at the same time, like, it's because Father Anatoly is like playing pranks on him all the time. So you kind of sympathize with Father Job a little bit. And he has a line where he says something like, "Don't I know my sins without you reminding me of them?" Which is an indication that he understands these pranks are supposed to sort of like bring his sins, you know, to his awareness. And so the aggressor, in a sense, is Father Anatoly.
Yeah.
You know, so he'll put like pitch on the door handle so his hands get dirty when he comes to visit him, or you know, I don't remember what other things he does to Father Anatoly in particular, but he also he plays pranks, a number of sort of prophetic pranks on the Father Superior as well.
It's interesting because there's also reason to believe that it's alluded to as well that Father Job is just simply jealous of Father Anatoly.
Yes.
You know,
that's why he asks, like, why did Cain kill Abel?
Yes, and it's not necessarily in a malicious way, like you know, at least not really aggressively. So we see Father Job kind of try to make overtures at, you know, friendliness or doing something nice for Father Anatoly. But these are kind of rebuked too, in, you know, maybe you think that it's stern, but there's a real spiritual recognition that there's an impurity of motives here, you know, and eventually it draws out this vulnerability, this vulnerable confession from Father Job that, yes, he admires Father Anatoly in a way, and yet he suffers from, this feeling that why not me too? Like you can see that some of the frustration that he feels for Father Anatoly's outward signs of holiness, his outward humility. He accuses it at one point of being vanity, but I think it's pretty clear
in a moment of frustration.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that it's more of a projection of his own vanity. And that this is not something that he's capable of.
On the whole, you wouldn't say that Father Job is persecuting or slandering Father. He does complain about him to the superior ones, but that's again because he's like playing pranks on him and stuff. So it's like there's some validity to it. Another interesting thing is that we see Father Anatoly apologize for his pranks, or for his comments on a number of occasions, and I'm not quite sure how much of that is like admission of wrongdoing or simply sort of an act of humility to kind of just try to set things right. Because there's a couple of times where he says like forget it, I'm sorry, forgive me for my
I think it's really fascinating because
it may be because he says, I'm mean, ain't I? Or something like that at one point.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
to
like,
Father Philaret.
Yeah, and so it's like, maybe he's recognizing some of these things are maybe imperfections in himself, like the way it's left a little bit open.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's so much a recognition of imperfection as just an acknowledgement that he'll accept the consequences of his actions.
Right.
Like if you want to rebuke him, if you want to spurn him, then, so be it.
Yeah.
But he is a gadfly,
Yeah.
And I think that, going back to this specific moment that you mentioned about his acknowledgement of his being mean.
Yeah, he said, I mean it, aren't I? That's what I am.
I don't think it's so much of an apology as just a kind of acknowledgement that, this is the role that he plays.
Okay.
But it is true that he does apologize elsewhere. And I do think that that's more about his humility. But what it illustrates for me is how there's all this drama, there's this interpersonal drama and a real spiritual drama that's unfolding among Father Anatoly, Father Job, and Father Philaret. They're kind of the three main characters whose arcs we're invested in. And yet, it's all happening in like good faith,
Yes.
Like there's really, all three of them are searching. Now, Father Philaret and Father Job both have their imperfections, and maybe even their sins, but they're operating under a kind of spiritual blindness that Father Anatoly doesn't suffer from.
Right.
And so he pretty incisively is able to cut through and expose, their imperfections and their sins.
Yeah.
And in both instances, I think we see them come around, to recognize and humble themselves, so it's very edifying,
Yeah, no, I like this trio of characters and the casting of each of them.
And it's a cool illustration of how brothers can live together,
Yes.
how they can, really, irk one another.
Yeah.
And yet conduce to their individual, sanctity,
And these are the core characters of the film because all of the visitors who come to him, they only come once.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they're not recurring characters.
But they are crucial. They are crucial as like a plot device.
Yes.
Not just for us to see Father Anatoly in action elsewhere.
Yeah.
See him recognizing what's really going on and cutting through.
Yeah.
But also as kind of a validation of his real holiness,
Yes.
his ability to really help people, so, in one instance there is a healing, and then in another instance there's what's, essentially an exorcism. And so, he casts out a demon,
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, pretty important, because if we didn't have those, then we would be taking a lot of these other interactions that are more subtle, between Father Philaret and Father Job. We would be taking those on a much more on faith, know. I mean, obviously, you take all of it on faith,
Right.
Yeah. I'm just so impressed by the film and its ability to sort of thread the needle on all of this stuff in a way that's very real, that strikes one as very truthful. I don't know to what extent the writers and the director are drawing from specific examples in the lives of these saints that were mentioned, but it feels like you're watching something pulled from the lives of the saints.
Some of the incidents with the people who come to him for help did make me think of these instances where Jesus heals someone in the Gospels.
Yes.
Because the truthfulness relies, it's not just this sentimental moment of healing or good counsel given or whatever, is often we see like resistance to his counsel.
Yeah.
Or the person, maybe they're going to go do what he says, but they kind of are also like really bummed out. And, it makes me think of when Jesus, only the one of the 10 comes back to thank Jesus, or when he tells people don't say anything and then they go tell everybody, or maybe the young man going away sad. So there's this very striking incident in particular where this woman comes with her son who has hurt his hip and and he prays and the son is healed, and he says to stay the night here, and Father Philaret will give him communion, and then he'll never limp again. And she's like, oh no, I have to work. And she's really attached to her job. And he finally just says, okay, get out of here. Cause like, she's not listening. She's not realizing like what's just happened. And it's like, oh, ye of little faith, kind of situation.
Yeah,
and so that it's a much, much more memorable than it would have been if she had just been healed. He had been healed and gone away.
He has a great line. He says, what do you think, I'm playing games here or something, and it's his kind of just being so taken aback by her response, he's like gobsmacked or whatever.
Yes.
Is that the word?
Yes, gobsmacked. And then she's going away on the boat with her son, and he runs out into the water, grabs her son, and he's like, if you don't care about yourself,
he says, if you don't care about yourself, at least care about your son or something like that.
Yeah, and then so he sort of forces them to stay and do what he said for the boy's sake. And it's just one of my favorite incidents in the film, because it's like this complexity of like physical versus spiritual, conversion and healing, and that it's not that easy, and the frustration of being. Every holy person with powerful prayers is probably asked to pray for like all kinds of things, including worldly, healings, or pray that I get this job, or am able to buy this house, and probably happily does so. And then, but what they really want for the people is that they find God. And I'm sure a lot of the time that doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen in that moment, and then the person kind of misses the point and then just goes away and isn't properly grateful, or just gets what they want and then is not interested in like the spiritual counsel that goes with it. So it does feel very truthful in that sense about the kind of like the loneliness of being a saint, where like nobody really gets it.
Yeah. Another way in which the film strikes me as being, very like grounded and real, and this is great because it's not always the case with saint movies, is in its depictions of prayer and liturgy and the sacraments. So I think we mentioned it, as far back as when we talked about A Man for All Seasons, as sort of, we don't really get a lot of indication of St. Thomas More in that film as a man of prayer.
Right.
And it's true of a lot of saint films that maybe, directors don't quite know what to do with this.
Yeah.
Certainly true of the recent Cabrini film.
Yeah.
And yet here, we really see Father Anatoly praying all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's the film from very early on is very careful to sort of introduce us into his routine of prayer. And we see him sometimes joining the rest of the community for Divine Liturgy. We see him give counsel to stay to, confess your sins or receive communion. A couple of times he exhorts people who come to see him to stay for communion. There and there too is a kind of deference to Father Filaret.
Yeah.
Father Filaret will give you communion in the morning.
Well, I guess that probably indicates that he's not a priest.
Yeah. Right. And so I so appreciate this because I think it's so easy to pass over, the whole sacramental life of the saints in these films about them.
Right.
And in another place where it's very strikingly illustrated is in this, quote unquote, like exorcism sequence. I put it in quotes because it's not like he's performing an exorcism like a rite of exorcism.
Yeah.
Or it's not what you would associate with that kind of.
He never addresses the demon or rebukes it or commands it. He prays to God.
He prays to God, and it's a prayer that we would find very relatable. It's just getting down, taking off your hat, kneeling and praying.
Yeah.
And right at the end, he's praying silently. And so there's his prayers have efficacy because of his trust in God. It's the same in the healing that happens.
Right.
He just asks them to pray with him. But it's not a kind of sentimentalized version of prayer. It's not Hollywood prayer. This is just very real prayer and supplication,
right?
And recitation of the Psalms, turning to Scripture.
Yeah.
The very first sequence of the film, even before the flashback that sort of sets the stage for this story, is of this monk, this Father Anatoly, walking and praying the Jesus prayer,
right,
over and over and over and over again. So to me, this is it's a great depiction of a sort of brass tacks spirituality, that relies on prayer and on the sacraments and on the liturgy of the hours and on Scripture.
Yeah.
And that's so seldom depicted in these kinds of films.
Yeah. That's a great point. And the film is also very funny.
Yeah.
Which is probably why you saw it labeled as a comedy drama. Because his interactions with his his other monks are just quite funny, and particularly the climax of the holy fool behavior is really when Father Filaret finally decides that he wants to live in the cell, so to speak, with Father Anatoly, and he didn't want to be a superior. He just wanted to be an ascetic, and he comes in and he's got this really nice blanket that he brought with him for them to like lay on the bed of coals that Father Anatoly sleeps on, and Father Anatoly wakes up during the night, and I'm not going to describe the whole scene in depth, but he chucks his nice boots into the fire. He then locks the door of the room and starts stoking the fires to smoke all the demons out of the room. And Father Filaret is just freaking out, trying to escape, and it's just this wild scene. And then they finally leave, and Father Anatoly throws the big blanket in the water, and it kind of floats off, and Father Filaret is just sort of shell shocked, and then ultimately thanks him and says, yes, you showed me I was too attached to these things.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful scene actually right after this like climactic and like bizarre moment, because we get the two of them in the frame, both looking off. They're speaking to each other, but they're both sort of facing the audience, so to speak. And they're having this conversation where Father Filaret is sort of confessing to this attachment to worldly things and this lack of faith. And then something in the expression of Father Anatoly as he's hearing this, so compelling. There's a kind of pained quality in his expression. Perhaps, in that moment, he's just wondering at how he can be an instrument of God in sort of affecting this kind of repentance and, deeper conversion. But there's just this very touching quality to this shot and this interaction between the two of them, where they're not looking at one another, and they're kind of two men facing the path in front of them, the path toward God. And I'm dwelling on this moment a little bit because it's indicative of another quality that this film has that puts it above a lot of other Saint films, is that of its cinematic poetry. I think it's a very poetic film in a lot of moments.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of striking symbols, and just room for really, there's a real thoughtfulness and artistry in the way this film is composed.
Yeah. I really like the look of the film,
yeah,
too.
the look is great. The look is great.
Colors and everything.
But, I'll just mention a couple of things. Like, it's called The Island. And yes, this community lives on an island, but Father Anatoly himself is even removed from that island. He's on almost an island of his own,
right, which
is kind of this little peninsula strip of land just off of the island.
Right.
They have to kind of cross a bit of a boardwalk to reach him there. Also a part of this island is the wreckage of the very ship that he had been on.
There's this rhythm of him going back and forth to collect the coal, which is almost symbolic of his constant awareness of what happened.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's significant that we see him shoveling coal in the flashback, and we see him shoveling coal. He's performing the same activity his whole life,
Yeah.
But of course, there's a great difference between the Anatoly of that flashback and the Anatoly that we see in this film.
Right.
It's called The Island, but for all of that, we really don't get a super strong sense of place in the film. There's a kind of disorienting quality where you don't get the kind of wide situational shots that really establish, where we are and where things are.
I don't think there's ever a helicopter shot of the island or anything.
No, and
like
so
that.
there is kind of a weird quality that the film has of you're never quite sure of where you are. There's a lot of transitional sequences where you see people rowing in boats. There's a lot of boats in the film.
Right.
And the boats sort of represent different things. We even see Father Anatoly cast out a little toy boat that he makes, we, like you mentioned, we see the blanket that's cast out into the water, and it floats off into the water. So there's this kind of sense of the island being this liminal space, and the water being kind of the seas of life, this sort of, we're cast out in this we're adrift in this existence. I think that the visuals are operating on this level in a lot of respects, and there's a lot of other things that I could point to, but I just mentioned some of those to kind of suggest to you this poetic quality that the film has, this thoughtfulness that it has. There's one other nice moment is when we're first introduced to the character of Father Filaret. He's restoring an icon that has sort of gotten really sooty from long usage, burning candles, and I was thinking, what's that about? I mean, we maybe get a hint of his worldliness because he's in a nice house. He's making pigment using an egg from a chicken that he's got in his home. So this is already a kind of luxury that
in fact, when I first saw him in that house, I didn't think he was a member of the community at all.
Sure.
I thought he was just a local craftsman,
But also there's something about, maybe evoking his search for Christ, his own need for conversion and for restoration in this image. But maybe there's also a hint of the hidden sanctity of Father Anatoly, that Christ is hidden in these foul conditions. I mean, Father Anatoly is dirty and covered with grime, and from the outside looking in, not particularly saintly. You know, in fact, when Father Job goes to first extend the invitation to Father Anatoly that he come stay with Father Filaret, he says, "Live with a saint, become a saint."
Yeah.
And this is like the pitch that he's making to Father Anatoly. Go live in Father Filaret's home. This is a kindness that he's doing you.
Yeah.
You'll benefit from it. Your health will benefit, but also you'll spiritually benefit. And of course, we see the complete reverse of that happen.
Right.
And there is this correct intuition: live with a saint, become a saint. And we see that very strikingly illustrated when Father Filaret goes and stays the night with Father Anatoly. It's the film is in addition to having this great spiritual weight and also reality, it's also got this artistic poetry that's very compelling as well.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk about the ending a bit.
Sure.
So spoilers from here on out. So we find out that this man, his captain that he had shot as a young man,
didn't actually die.
Didn't die. Didn't die.
He's the father of the possessed woman who comes to him for deliverance.
And so there's this mutual recognition at the end, and this sort of confession that is made by Father Anatoly to Tikhon.
And a reconciliation because he forgives him.
Yes.
And it's sort of like the last note before Father Anatoly can let his soul depart, basically.
Right. And then so after that, the film ends with the preparations for Father Anatoly's death, and then Father Job on the boat carrying this cross that I assume is for the grave of Father Anatoly. It's kind of a low key ending, given like that this. Well, first of all, did you think that it was a little too neat that it ends with the guy that he
probably
shot? Yeah,
probably.
I think it was a little neat for me, and interestingly, it's the reconciliation is very low key. Like, it doesn't feel very cathartic. At least I didn't experience it that way.
Yeah.
It's like maybe it's realistic in that way, in the sense that we do see Tikhon sort of reacting with a sort of restrained shock when he realizes what's going on, and we but there's no like tears, there's no hugging. It's like he almost like looks away from him when he says like, "I forgive you."
I mean, I wonder if this is not sort of a gesture at Father Anatoly's humility, that it would be vanity to sort of indulge in a big reconciliation with all this catharsis. I think that it gives this moment, as neat as the moment is, as sort of like Deus ex machina as it is, it retains this quality of spiritual realness, I think, for not veering into the melodramatic,
Right.
And so if Tikhon is kind of restrained, one gets the impression that maybe it's because he wouldn't forgive him so easily if he hadn't just delivered his daughter from this terrible oppression, so that maybe there's there's some conflict on his part. I have to forgive this man.
Yeah. Right.
And then if Father Anatoly is kind of low key about it, it's maybe because, well, he doesn't want to indulge, and that it's not about, it's not really about this or about him in this moment, but about justice and the need to apologize.
What do you make of when he invites right after the exorcism? He says, "Don't you want to confess?" Anatoly says that to the guy, and then he ends up being the one who confesses. Is that just a ruse to get him alone so he can talk to him, or is there any deeper sort of?
No, I think that's probably it. I mean, because he knows who he is as soon as he introduces himself, and I think that it's interesting in a way. Maybe we need to have this moment because we see that ultimately it's not about this sin that he's committed, in what he's thought, murdering Tikhon. Because even when he finds that he didn't in fact kill him, it doesn't change anything for him. He's still aware of his sinfulness.
Yes.
He's still aware of his need for mercy, and he's still, committed to his life of prayer and asceticism.
Yeah. So that was the other thing I wanted to bring up, is that, even after this happens, he lies down in his own coffin and is talking to Father Job, who says, "Aren't you afraid to die?" And he says, "I'm not afraid to die, but I am afraid to stand before God. My sins oppress me and all of that." And you'd think it would be like, yes, now I'm at peace.
Yeah.
Right. But he throughout the way he talks about his sins stays the same throughout the film. And I do wonder a little bit. I mean, in a sense, it seems like a stupid question to ask, like, what's the nature of his burden when he shot this guy? But I do ask, what is the nature of it? It's not surprising that he is burdened in some way, or that he still feels bad about it. But the question of is there a point at which there should be a greater peace? He does say, "I have no peace in my soul" at one point. Now there's a context in which that he might be trying to make a different point than literally lacking spiritual peace. But that's one of the questions I come away from the film is does he have that deeper peace, or is this something that he's only going to find with death? Does he feel like he hasn't sufficiently done penance? I don't know if they think in terms of reparation in the East. That seems like we kind of think of atonement and penance and reparation as all part of the same thing, but I don't know if in the East they think in terms, they certainly don't think of making reparation, consoling the heart of Jesus, or things like that. I'm sure that they do have, some of the monks in, one of the monks in the Brothers Karamazov does talk about, something like suffering for the world, or something like that. So there is something of that.
Yeah, and
being guilty for the sins of all men.
He is praying
kind of
for
thing.
Tikhon at the beginning of the film.
Yes,
he's asking for that his sins be forgiven.
That's right.
He is interceding for him.
Yes. So my question is what kind of? I wonder if some of this reflects a different spirituality in the Russian Orthodox Church, or a different attitude towards being a lifelong penitent, and you can never say I've made reparation for this particular sin, or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if there's anything that feels like a little bit of an off note, it's this ending, because you would want perhaps more explicit acknowledgement of trust in God, confidence in God.
Yeah.
But I think that if I'm to play, I don't want to call it the devil's advocate, but if I'm to sort of try to couch this as best I can, I would say that his charism has essentially been to be this angel of repentance, calling people to repentance, and always sort of affirming that he's nothing before God. Elsewhere we hear him say, my virtues stink
before God,
before him,
Yeah.
And look, that's true. It's even Mary is nothing compared to God, So there is a truth there. So I wonder if it isn't just sort of right to the end, he's saying this for the benefit of Father Job, who's the one he's saying it to in that moment.
Father Job asks him for how am I going to live, and he says, well, we're all sinners, live however you can, and just try not to sin too much.
Try not to sin too much, yeah, and I think
simple,
yeah, right, and it's so I don't get the impression that this is for want of trusting in God or relying on his mercy.
I do wonder, he says, I'm afraid to die with this sin, and so it is that.
Well,
I wonder. It makes me wonder: has he ever confessed that to a priest? Has he ever gone to confession?
I'm
with that
sure
sin?
that he has. I'm sure that he has. His piety is clear,
Yeah.
but you always have to take these things that he says with a grain of salt, because in my viewing, he's always saying things for the benefit of the person that he's speaking with, because this is a man who's clearly elsewhere, feigning, idiocy to
Right.
try to, to some calculated end. I think that you can't, there's an instance of like unreliable narrator here,
Right.
because like that moment that you just alluded to, he's not being totally forthright with the person that he's speaking with, in other respects. And so when he says, what was the line? I'm still carrying this sin or whatever.
I don't want to. I'm still burdened. At the end, he says, "I'm still burdened by my sins." There's an earlier line where he says, "I don't want to die. I'm afraid to die with this
Yes,
sin." I don't know
right.
when he says that.
So it's like, I don't know that he's if he's not playing the fool in that moment too. If he's just as capable of saying something for a particular effect elsewhere, why not here too? If he's he might be playing a part.
At any rate, it's a kind of an austere ending. It's like an emotionally austere ending, both in his death and his reconciliation with this man. It doesn't feel very cathartic to me.
No.
And that may be a feature or a bug, but the death of the Saint Nectarios in Man of God was more kind of like,
sure,
almost you can see his soul rising to heaven as he dies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, or you think of other films, the way that they ended, the ending of Calvary is like way more, emotionally affecting. And
right.
So it is kind of an odd ending, but it's an odd film. Like that. That's the thing.
About
is
an
that
odd man.
Yeah, the whole film is very interesting, very unlike anything else you've seen, and very worth watching. I think the one last thing I'd like to add is just that the music is really nice.
Yeah, the music is nice.
It's nice in the same way that everything else is nice. It's kind of odd, it goes out on a limb.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that can be said about this film in all of its aspects, is that it kind of goes out on a limb,
Right.
And so it takes a risk.
Yeah.
And the film, the music is a good illustration of that, because it's got a real character to it.
Yeah.
Very distinct and not at all obvious. It's not like an obvious match with the rest of the film.
There are sort of like choral voice sounds, but even the way they're used is not
only in like two or three instances.
Yeah.
Elsewhere it's little like piano motifs, or there's like this woodwind. And so very, very interesting choices being
almost
made.
Miyazaki sounding.
Totally. There's a kind of whimsical quality to it, that in some places feels
whimsical, but not in a cartoony way.
It's also melancholic.
Yes, whimsical in a melancholic way. It's nice. Some of the strings and voices sound very like synthesized sounding. But I think it's a nice soundtrack.
Yes. And I ultimately I'm looking at the intention behind it, because it's clearly going for something, and that's something that I just appreciate with the film overall, is that it's clearly going for something, and it does so well enough. Yeah.
And when it hits this very sort of classical sounding string piece at the end, as the boat is going away with the cross, it did remind me of like Tarkovsky's use of classical pieces, say like in The Sacrifice or something like that. But then it sort of the choral sounds come in and it gets kind of funky sounding again. Yeah. Well, anything else to say, or can we wrap up here?
No, I think that's where can people watch it?
I bought it on Amazon Prime. I think it's on YouTube too, but I don't know if that's like legally or if there may be subtitles. I didn't look at the YouTube video.
Yeah. Well, you can rent it on Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so that's The Island from 2006. There's a number of films named The Island, so you want the Russian one from 2006.
Yeah.
Make sure you don't watch some goofy other film. But all right, everybody, thanks. And we've got one more Lenten movie for you. I'm hoping we're going to be doing and sort of a stranger version of the biblical epic from 1961, which is called Barabbas. And that's quite an interesting film. So we'll see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.